The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept in full. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 1, actually, the only day, this Sunday, March 9th, 2014, and it's a regular morning sitting. It's not exactly a regular morning sitting because it's immediately after a workshop, but at any rate, I'd like to share with you first something out of a book called The Enlightened Mind, which is an anthology of sacred writings. It was put together by Stephen Mitchell quite a long time ago. And this particular quote is from Huang Po, or Obaku, a Chinese Zen master, very, very deeply realized Zen master. And here is what he said. This pure mind, which is the source of all things, shines forever with the radiance of its own perfection. This pure mind, which is the source of all things, shines forever with the radiance of its own perfection, and that is what we are. But most people are not aware of it and think that the mind is just the faculty that sees, hears, feels, and knows. Blinded by their own sight, hearing, feeling, and knowing, they don't perceive the radiance of the source. If they could eliminate all conceptual thinking, this source would appear like the sun rising through the empty sky and illuminating the whole universe. Therefore, you students of the Tao who seek to understand through seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing, when your perceptions are cut off, your way to mind will be cut off and you will find nowhere to enter. Just realize that although mind is manifested in these perceptions, it is neither part of them nor separate from them. You shouldn't try to analyze these perceptions or think about them at all, but you shouldn't seek the one mind apart from them. Don't hold on to them or leave them behind or dwell on them or reject them. Above, below, and around you, all things spontaneously exist because there is nowhere outside the Buddha mind. When we're born, we come into this world already complete. Of course we develop, of course we grow, and that continues our entire life. And hopefully the growth of awareness and mind expansion and let-go-ness also continues the rest of our life. But we're already there. We're already people. We're already possessed of this one mind that Huang Po Obaku was speaking of. And it is through our practice that we seek to return to an openness, a comprehension, a living from, without hindrance, that true mind. Many of you know the story of Shidoan, who was accused as a middle-aged monk in 17th century Japan of fathering a child. And it was not his child. He was not the father. But nonetheless, he was roundly accused of it, and because the young girl who was the mother of the baby insisted that he was the father, there was no questioning it by anybody. And so when the baby was born, the grandparents marched it over to Shidoan and presented it to him, deeply embarrassed in their village life, and seeking to have him at least take some responsibility for this child by raising it. And so they gave it over to him. The interesting thing about it is that despite the fact that it was not his child, that he was wrongly accused, he simply said something that's very difficult to translate into English. Essentially, what he said was, "Oh, I see it looks like this, doesn't it? It seems to be this way, doesn't it?" And he received the child without objection, raised it for a year, and then the mother confessed who the father really was. And now the grandparents, who are once again deeply embarrassed, come back and take the child back. Heads bowed, deep apologies. They ask for the child back, explaining the situation. And Shido went on again. All he says is, "Oh, I see, it does seem like that, doesn't it?" No need in either event to defend himself, to be angry, to be upset, to get really, really out to lunch on this. Recriminations, no recriminations. Just simple 100% acceptance that this is what his karma had brought him at that point in time. And it was clear, I'm sure, to him that there was no point in even objecting one bit when he was given the baby. And again, when the grandparents took the baby back, he saw no reason to say anything like, "I should have told you so. You should have realized I wouldn't have done such a thing." Nothing. Because he had opened to great depths to that mind that Wangpo is speaking of. And he was experiencing the tremendous freedom and joy and ease in life that comes from having experienced deeply that true mind. And as part of the process, having let go enough of his stuff, as Chisan would say, his stuck places, that he could truly be free to respond in each of those moments without rancor. Now, how many of us are able to do that in our own lives? The good news is, here we sit in the Zendo. We have this incredible practice that will take us there if we give ourselves to it. And here I'd like to speak of practice. Zen practice is not easy, but it is something that will bring us greater freedom than anything else can bring us in our entire life. It is something that will bring us greater ease, greater joy than anything else can bring us in our life. And that ease and that joy are lasting if we persist in the practice. When we first begin to practice, it's pretty interesting. We're engaged in it because we're learning how to work with the body and how to focus the mind. And then the honeymoon period ends, and some amount of shit begins to hit the fan. And many people quit, unfortunately, at that point, because that's exactly where you can start doing some deeper work. Zen practice is not, as the beat poets thought in the 1950s, doing anything you feel like and being free to do anything you feel like and not have any consequences to it. That's not what it's about. It's about being truly one with our life, deeply responsible, and opening to our innate compassion and wisdom and allowing that to function more and more completely. As we do the practice, as someone perceptively said quite a long time ago, after a sesshin in which they had had a kensho experience, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. Wouldn't it be nice if we could simply be set free? Now, that's not the way it happens. We have to see where we're caught first before we can be set free. Until then, we're blindly going along, driven by our habit patterns, driven by our conditioning, driven by a sense of a self that we need to defend, that we need to protect, at great cost, and we don't even know how we are living our life truly. We're not aware often of a tone of voice that we use, for example, in reaction to something. We're not aware of how we argue, for example. We're not aware of how we defend and defend and defend. And what are we defending? There's nothing really to defend, as Shidoan found out. There truly is nothing to defend. Suzuki Roshi, in speaking of this period of what Torei Enji, whose chant we just did, called the long maturation, as circumstances where we become more aware of places where we're behaving unskillfully, where places where we're giving in to anger or irritation or doing a knee-jerk reaction against something without even considering the full picture. He called it mind weeds, and he said they make wonderful manure. Now, if you're old enough, you lived in an era when farms were fertilized with cow poop, basically. And in the springtime, driving through Ohio, for example, the air reeked of manure. But that manure fed that soil, enriched it, and made it bear fruit more readily than it could have otherwise. And it's the same with that manure of our mind. Every time we see where we're caught, we see where, oh shit, why did I do that? Why did I answer that way? Why didn't I respond rather than react to what just happened? When we see that clearly, it gives us the opportunity to let it go. Now, how do we let it go? By owning it, by feeling completely the embarrassment, the discomfort of having done something unskillful or inappropriate, reacted to a situation, perhaps in anger, certainly in self-defense. When we can see it, we can tune in, feel it, own it, allow ourselves to experience the physical sensations in our body, not to get into the story of it, because stories are stories. Thoughts create stories, and that doesn't free us. It's the experiential angst of having done something we're not proud of, we regret, that will then give us a heads up the next time we would almost automatically go there. And we start to see ourselves reacting and we feel, wait a minute, I don't want to go there. I'm not going to do that. And we don't. It takes awareness. It takes a willingness to walk in. It takes a willingness to see clearly what's going on in our own minds. And the practice is vital in here. The practice is an absolutely vital participant in this process. So the practice is basically twofold. It's about coming to awakening. It's about seeing deeply and clearly the true nature of reality. And then continuing our practice to see it even more clearly and even more deeply. And continuing beyond that to see even more clearly and more widely and more deeply. And continuing on beyond that. Accompanying that, we work on what, again, Torei Enji, who was the premier dharma successor of Hakuin, the great Zen master Hakuin, who said that what is really important in practice is putting it into action, is living it. And he called it the long maturation. We don't have to have had kensho before we begin work on the long maturation. We can start at any moment. But the Zazen is a vital underpinning to it, because without the Zazen, we're just hanging out in our heads, generally speaking, and not reaching where transformation can happen, which is deep within the mind. So, as we go along in our daily life, to be as aware as possible, and the Zazen helps with that, and to pay attention to where, for example, we may not be being as aware as we could be. Washing the dishes. Somebody else comes along and says, hey, look at this frying pan. There's still stuff on it, even though it's sitting in the drying rack. To be careful when we do things, to be aware when we do things, to be thorough when we do things, not to multitask when we do things. And to be aware of what's going on in our minds as we encounter situations, as we encounter people, things. Are we reacting or are we responding? Are we getting irritated? And if so, who is it that's getting irritated? Where's this irritation coming from? Try to trace it down into the depths of your body, into the depths of your mind. It's not about somebody else doing something to us. The choice is ours in what we do in response or reaction. Nobody else is responsible for our reactions in life than we ourselves. And the more clear we can be in our activities, the fewer reactions we'll have and the more responses we'll have. And the cleaner and clearer and more rich and fulfilled and simple our life will be. This is the vital practice and action that Hakuin said is 10,000 times, 10,000 times more effective than practice on the cushion, except that both are needed. For the practice and action to function, to occur, requires that practice on the cushion. And so both are very important. And then the practice on the cushion, it's not just about experiencing the extension of our out-breath and reaching far beyond what we may think or feel or understand through that out-breath, being curious. It's not about working with the koan. These are the basic fundamentals of our practice, the essentials of our practice. But without that next step of taking it in our daily life, it's of no use. It won't bring us lasting peace and happiness unless we integrate it. Because only then will our life change. Only then will we become more free. And that freedom is freedom from the stuff we would ordinarily be caught in otherwise. You all have heard the story of Jacques Lucéran, the young man, Frenchman, who was blinded at the age of 8 in a school accident. His eyesight wasn't that great to begin with, so he was wearing glasses, and this was before they had lenses that were shatterproof. And the kids are all rushing out to recess, and somebody shoves him from behind, and he stumbles into the edge of the teacher's desk, and that was the end of his sight. But his parents were quite enlightened. They didn't view it as the end of his life, as some people would. They viewed it simply as a corner to turn and go in a different direction. And so they worked with the school and made it possible for him to be mainstreamed. So he stayed in his regular school. All he had to do was learn Braille during the summer, which he did quickly. And he continued through grade school, through high school, with his classmates. And they used to go hiking even. And he had developed through that a deep sense of people and things. And it's very interesting that he wrote that if he got angry or possessive, that suddenly he was stumbling into things. His sense of where things were in his environment just vanished. But if he could keep his mind clear and not be attached to things, then he had no problem moving around among obstacles that he couldn't literally see. It's an interesting lesson for all of us. But as you also know, when he was in high school, France was invaded by the Nazis, and people began to disappear. People that these high school kids valued, felt were really, really wonderful, interesting people, like the uncle of one of their classmates. And they also noticed that the French people were getting quite frightened of what the Nazis were telling them. And so they decided they should do something about it. They rightly guessed that the Nazis would ignore high school kids pedaling around on their bicycles with papers in the basket, figuring they were just kids taking their homework home or going to school or whatever. And so they managed to get hold of some clandestine radios and listen to the news from the West, news from the Allies, and began to write what was really happening so that the French people could understand that they were just being inundated with propaganda and not the truth. And for 2 years, they peddled these newspapers all over France every 2 weeks. And it helped a great deal and got the invaders worried. And they finally managed to find out who a few of these kids were. There was one person, that Jacques, who was the one that made decisions about who was to be part of the group and who wasn't, was not really very happy about accepting into the group. He felt something was wrong with this guy, that he wasn't honest. But because he came highly recommended by somebody that Jacques did trust, he went ahead and accepted him, and it was exactly that person that betrayed them. But because they were very careful in how they organized the group, which by then had grown to 500 kids, only about 22 of them were actually picked up, because the rest were unknown. And first they were put in French prison, and then they were taken to Buchenwald, where Jacques was put into what was known as the Invalids Block. The Invalids Block, all of these barracks in that concentration camp were overcrowded. The Invalids Block was severely overcrowded. He wrote that even where 400 men would be a crowd, they had 1,000 in this building. And he said you could not move anywhere without bumping into another body. It was pretty wretched for him. He survived because one of the intake prisoners whispered to him that he should identify himself as a translator, which he did. He said he was a translator of Russian, Polish, and another language, not German. And even though he didn't know the other two languages, by the time he left the camp he did. And so he was spared. But because he was blind, other desperate prisoners stole his bread. The prisoners were not fed adequately. A little soup and some crusts of bread. And so the major part of his inadequate to begin with meal was stolen. And eventually, after 5 months of hell, because people were dying all around him, either shot or knifed or felled by the rocks in the quarry in which they were required to work, or marched out to the tunes of a band and shot as a group. and people were going crazy. It was truly a hell realm. And as I began to say, after 5 months, he just couldn't take it anymore, and he became quite ill. Many, many different ways. His body was shutting down. His heart was beating wildly and out of control. His kidneys were failing. His guts were writhing in extreme pain. His face was all swollen up with some kind of condition. All of these were told to him later, identified, I should say, as to what exactly they were medically, by doctors in the camp who were prisoners themselves. There was not a single bit of medicine in the camp. And so when it was clear that he was dying, a couple of other prisoners took him away to what they euphemistically called the hospital, which was a piece of concrete somewhere outdoors, and laid him down to die. And he tuned in to exactly what was going on in his body. And this is important to remember. Despite the fact that it was extremely painful, perhaps frightening, he tuned in. And this is a key to how to work with this stuff that comes up in our mind. Tune in. Don't think about it. Ignore the thoughts. Feel it. Feel the sensations in the body. Is it tight in the shoulders? Are the hands cold? Is there tension in the back? What about the belly? How does that feel? That's often a dead giveaway. And in tuning in so completely, he came to a very deep awakening. In the middle of hell, he came to a very deep awakening. This is something else to keep in mind. Because we all have our stuff. And some of us, no doubt, have stuff from childhood that was perhaps quite frightening, perhaps quite painful. And Zazen is going to take the lid off all of that if we allow it to do so. And as it begins to do so, it's important to walk right in. If it is extreme, then it's also important to get the assistance of a mental health professional. A good therapist can help us walk through this stuff, and with the Zazen work as well, we can make great strides through it and have a truly positive effect. It's very interesting. I knew at least 3 therapists who were members of the Rochester Zen Center, and every single one of them told me that Zen practitioners doing therapy progressed far faster than people doing therapy who were not Zen practitioners, who didn't have that extra tool in their life. So Jacques Lucien had a deep awakening experience as a result of tuning in, not tuning out, not trying to avoid feeling what he was feeling. And the amazing thing about this is that he wrote that he found joy. In the middle of that hell realm, he found joy. That awakening showed him a far deeper, freer picture, a truer picture. And through that he found joy. And furthermore, he said that joy never left him. It was 11 more months before the Allies liberated the camp. And that joy never left him. And after that, nobody stole his bread. After that, instead, they would wake him up in the middle of the night and lead him to somebody who was freaking out because he could calm them down. He brought peace to people because he knew it intimately himself, despite what was going on. And this is the choice we have. It doesn't matter what happens to us, in a certain sense. Of course, if there's something that can be done about abuse, for example, then it's appropriate to do that. But if there are situations that we cannot get ourselves out of, how we respond to those situations makes all the difference in the world. And how much Zazen we have done before that point makes that difference. Like Shidoan, being able to receive that baby. There he is, a middle-aged man, never had kids of his own. In those days, Buddhist monks were celibate. In Japan, they aren't anymore, but they were then. And he just carried it around like an old grandmother on his back, working in his garden, trying to raise food because the villagers scorned him. And the reason we know this story is because they were so impressed by his responses to these two situations that they carried the story down through the centuries, and we know it now. Hakuin talked about it, and it's mistakenly attributed to him, but it actually happened to his grandfather in Zen, Shidoan. So, to recapitulate, practice is twofold. We have our Zazen, in which we work to clarify our mind. If thoughts come, let them come. Just don't get wrapped up in them. Keep that out-breath going. Reach. Give yourselves more completely to that out-breath. Eventually the thoughts will kind of disappear on their own. You don't have to get rid of them. And in fact, we don't want to try to get rid of them for two reasons. One is they'll get stronger if we do, and the other is we don't want to bring ourselves to a place where we don't think, because thinking is an important tool for human beings. It's just not everything that we think it is. It's a useful tool, but there's plenty more that can be done very effectively in our life, more effectively in our life, if we do it beyond thought. So first, to take that practice deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and as far as I can tell in my own life practice, there's no end to it. And that's what Dogen said as well. There's no beginning to enlightenment, and there's no end to practice. We're already there. We just don't recognize it. And the practice is about uncovering that awakened mind. And then the parallel path, both of which are essential, is to bring that to life in our everyday life. And when we do that, it's the most important thing a human being can do. Moreover, it's deeply fulfilling. Ceremony. I thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.